Hello and welcome to another fun-filled edition of Adam's Music Box. Now, today I'm going to talk about the soundtrack from a movie I've never seen, and it came out, in 1993, so maybe one of these days I'll get around to seeing it. But the film, of course, is Sleepless in Seattle. But what we're going to talk about is the soundtrack, because while it was right smack dab in the 90s, it was a very, very un-90s soundtrack in terms of the selection. Now, the 90s, much like the 80s, was an era when a lot of pop music that was pre-existing dominated the soundtrack market. In fact, in the 90s, there was even a bigger trend to use music that had already been released, and in most cases already achieved, some sort of status as a hit in terms of the songs, where the 80s there was a bit more originality, although there was a mix in both decades. But it was, if you like popular music, a golden age of modern soundtracks. Now, what was unique about this? While the pop music on the Sleepless in Seattle soundtrack bore no relationship to the 1990s, in fact, it was all songs from the Great American Songbook that were sung by the original singers. So you had people like Nat King Cole, you had Jimmy Durante, you had Louis Armstrong, you had Gene Autry, and you had some younger musicians, but singing in this style. People like Harry Connick Jr., Joe Cocker doing the great standard Bye Bye Blackbird. And this, I think, was very interesting because it was definitely a risk. The 90s was an age of grunge rock and hip hop, and yes, modern R&B. People like Whitney Houston were very popular, and Vogue, and some of the glam bands and metal bands of the 80s were still hanging on. But what it was certainly not was a time for the Great American Songbook. In fact, you could say it was the nadir of the Great American Songbook. In 1995, after this was released, to be fair, Dean Martin died a few years after that. Sinatra died. Sammy Davis Jr. was long dead. And so it was an era when some of the greats of the classic pop era, so called, the people with a jazz musical idiom, popularized these great American songbook songs. They were becoming long in the tooth, and many, if not retiring, were passing away. And so it was a huge risk to reintroduce that music to these audiences. Now, unlike today, the generation who grew up as youngsters listening to Sinatra and Perry Como and Dean Martin, Victor Moan, they were still alive. They weren't spring chickens, but they were still alive and buying records. But even so, records and movies tend to be aimed either at the middle-aged or the young, or perhaps more appropriately, the middle-aged who have the money but want to still feel young. But the soundtrack was a huge success, so much so that they even spawned a sequel to the soundtrack called More Songs from Sleepless Nights, which carried on in that same vein. And I just wonder if this soundtrack and the sort of movement it spawned helped a younger generation to gain interest in music that a lot of people unfortunately thought was dead. Even though the songwriting quality of the Great American Songbook was peerless, the arrangements of many of the most famous recordings were done by the greatest arrangers of all time. My favorites being Don Costa and Gordon Jenkins, but there were, of course, many, many others. And so what happens when you insert people like Nat King Cole into the 1990s? Well, eventually, I think it really saved these songs in that it made it acceptable for people from the next generation to carry on where that greatest of all great American songbook generations left off. So, for instance, Harry Connick Jr., this album really helped his career, and he made a career of being, a sort of latter day, neo great American songbook, modern classic pop singer. And then you had a lot of bands by the late 90s that were aping the swing sound. The one that did it best was Brian Setzer and his orchestra. He started out with the rockabilly stuff in the 80s with the Stray Cats. By the 90s, he had his orchestra. And then so many big band clones came along, not necessarily playing explicitly in the style of the 30s and 40s, but definitely tipping their hat to it. And then just under 10 years later, you had Rod Stewart come out with his Great American Songbook album. And that really cemented the fact that, much like classical music before it and many types of folk songs before it, these songs from the Great American Songbook will not go away. Don't get me wrong, I don't think they would have ever gone away, but they may have faded into deeper obscurity before later being revived, where Sleepless in Seattle helped them within just about the lifetime as the singers who made them famous. It helped keep the trajectory going and saying it is fun and it is cool for people in their 20s and 30s in the 90s to sing these songs that were made famous by people who were nearing the end. So, a happy ending there. Don't know if the movie has a happy ending because I haven't seen it, but you'll have to let me know in the comments. Like, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Take care.